Let's begin today's webinar of BioTherapy Live. We have a very, very special guest whom I'm going to introduce right now, Dr. William Parker, who is Associate Professor of Surgery at Duke University and has published nearly 200 papers. His education, if we start with the undergraduate education, he was a double major in chemistry and biology. I learned that by reading the CV. And did his, so he got his double major from Arkansas, University of Arkansas, and his PhD in chemistry from the University of Nebraska. And my phone is on mute, but apparently, or is on sleep mode, but apparently it's not sleeping. So sorry, sorry for that interruption. His research interests include inflammatory diseases, the role of helminths in normal immune and neuropsychiatric function, gut immunity, and protein folding. And I also didn't realize that protein folding is one of his major contributions to science, along with some of his immunology work, and the role of the appendix in biome maintenance. He also invented a device for purification of helminths to avoid damaging the organisms and to meet FDA purity guidelines. And that got me thinking about his non-direct science activities of blacksmithing. He's even a blacksmithing instructor. Dr. Parker has won many, many awards and honors, which I will not list, but I do want to mention that in addition to his many scientific and educational activities, he also has made time to be one of the editorial board members of the World Journal of Gastroenterology, the executive director of Immunity's Forge, a nonprofit organization supporting research on the human biome, and chairman of WormStar Mutualistic Helminths. So with that very brief and inadequate description of Dr. Parker's, can we call them accolades or curriculum vitae, I'm going to transfer this with Albert's help. I'm going to transfer the desktop and microphone to Dr. Parker. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sherman. Thank you for that very kind introduction. It is a pleasure to be here. And I noticed that at least there's one expert that I see that's here, Detlef Ghosh. So he's truly a leading expert, if not the world's leading expert in one of the worms that I'll be talking about today. So hopefully at the end of this, we'll get to hear from him and maybe some of the other folks that are on the call. I'll go ahead and start out with a PowerPoint presentation. Feel free to ask questions. Those will be mediated by Albert, who's watching for questions coming in. So let's go ahead and share the screen. So today I'd like to give folks an update on where we're at with translating Helminth therapy to the clinic. And of course, Helminth therapy is the idea of using intestinal worms known as helminths to treat various kinds of diseases that involve chronic inflammation. We'll go into that in some detail in just a minute. I do want to show you The disclosures, although I am CEO of a company, I'm not allowed to make any money on that because I still do human subjects research. So I don't personally have a conflict of interest, a financial conflict of interest, but Duke University does, and they asked that I disclose that. Let's start out by just saying that in the West, we do have, and I say in the West, in countries that are post-industrial in nature, Western Europe more so, increasingly so in Eastern Europe now, and other parts of the world, and especially in the United States and Australia, there's tremendous burden of chronic inflammatory disease. And by inflammation, we're talking about when the immune system is angry, it's revved up, but it's not a productive kind of anger. It's a anger that causes allergies, it causes autoimmunity. And increasingly, we're learning that this kind of inflammation is causing neuropsychiatric problems, including everything from narcolepsy to chronic fatigue to anxiety disorders and major depressive disorder. And as you can see in this slide here, 43% of our children are now on, which is an astounding number, now on some kind of medication for chronic conditions. It's just an incredible problem. When I talk to my students, we do little calculations and some exercises, just asking them, what are your chances of having 2 or 3 healthy children? And of course, that's a big eye opener for many of the students, if not all of them. Now, in this slide, I'm kind of showing you this criminally oversimplified view of what makes us sick. There's 5 major, what we call evolutionary mismatches. So there's something in our environment that's changed, that's making us sick. That's what we call an evolutionary mismatch. Biota alteration is the one that we're addressing with Helminth therapy. We'll talk about that in more detail, but of course, inflammatory diets and sedentary lifestyle are very well known to be disease causing, especially with cardiovascular disease. Chronic psychological stress and vitamin D deficiency are also major evolutionary mismatches, but people seem to be less aware of those. And the strength of the yellow arrow here more or less tells you how strong the link is between the evolutionary mismatch and the class of disease. And cancer is a special one. Different cancers have different links to different evolutionary mismatches. But for example, breast cancer is linked very strongly only to sedentary lifestyle, and another evolutionary mismatch that's not on here, which is less childbearing in high-income countries. This list is not meant to include everything. It's kind of a general overall synopsis. So back to this idea of we need more education about chronic psychological stress. At least in our medical students at Duke, psychological stress is almost a badge of honor. We should think of it probably more along the lines of chronic cigarette smoking or something. It's incredibly unhealthy. We're aware of the inflammatory diets and sedentary lifestyle. We'll focus on what we call biota alteration. The biota is just a biology term, which means the life associated with an ecosystem. In this case, we're talking about the ecosystem of the human body. Graham Rook is the one who did quite a bit of groundbreaking work on this area. How does modern society change our biota? And the biggest change that we have is that we've lost what we call complex eukaryotic symbionts. These are mostly intestinal worms, but also include what were known as protozoans. We now call them protists. These are more complex than yeast. We still have our yeast, and maybe too much yeast now because of our diet, but we've lost these organisms here that train and help regulate our immune system. We've lost some contact with good germs, primarily due to changes in diet, but also due to loss of contact with soil and antibiotic use. And because of the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago, we have more contact with what we call crowd infections. Immunizations helped to mitigate a lot of that problem. So the big player, we believe, and we can talk about this later. Some people think it has something to do with the microbiota. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for that. I think it's more these large, complex symbionts such as helminths that have been completely eliminated from the ecosystem of our body, and are, as a direct result, our immune regulation is just not that good. Now, the mechanisms of that, the problem, the immunological mechanisms have been known for some time. This is you see there's a paper here almost 20 years ago in Science, which is a very conservative mainstream journal, talking about the different ways that helminths regulate immune function. And when you've got organisms that have been with our immune systems for 400 million years, back to the time when our ancestors were jawed fishes. If you take all those organisms away, suddenly things will change. You get upheaval. In ecological terms, it's called loss of a keystone species. So there's just a couple of references here about the biochemical mechanisms, which are many and varied. There's dozens, if not hundreds, of molecules that helminths produce that regulate immune function. I'm going to give you a very brief overview of general data on what helminths do to human beings. So helminths have a reputation, and it's absolutely accepted in the scientific community. If you read any biology textbook, you will see that helminths are thought of as uniformly as parasites. And parasite, by definition, is something that harms the body for its own benefit. But when you look at what's been done in the literature, you see that by and large, helminths are not parasites. And that's, again, this contradicts everything that you find in any biology textbook to this day. The largest study ever done in human history was done deworming this was in northern India, where everyone has some exposure to helminths, or at least everyone in the areas that they're looking at here. They're not looking in some of the major cities where some people don't have exposure to helminths. They looked at 5 million human years of life. It was randomized, it was placebo controlled. What they found was no significant effect on weight from deworming and no significant effect on death. The thinking was, well, okay, we're not in the tropics here where some people have so many worms that it can kill you, and that's of course been documented. Also, they thought, we're not looking at more sensitive measures such as neurological development or the ability of the children to learn under these circumstances. So maybe the deworming is helping there, even though it doesn't affect death or weight gain. But another large study, not nearly as large as the one in India, but still fairly large, was done in China. They produced educational materials. You see copies of the covers of a couple of those here, talking to the children about the dangers of worms. And they all, in this case, they did look at neurological development. They looked at how well those children did in school. And what they found was that there was no effect of deworming. So millions upon millions of dollars were spent on deworming in temperate climates, but we don't know that there's no evidence that it's having any effect, which suggests that the helminths themselves are not detrimental, at least under these conditions. And that the idea here expressed by the authors was that, again, there's not that many helminths. There's just some helminths that the kids have. And at that level, they don't appear to be dangerous, because getting rid of them doesn't help the children. So if we look at what the helminths do accomplish in terms of benefit, then that's where we start to see things happen. It's been known since 1968. Brian Greenwood was the first one to figure out that helminths can be beneficial. He was 3 years out of medical school. He went to Africa and found that the people here don't have the same level of autoimmune disease. And at that time, there was some controversy. They thought, well, maybe they have it, but people just haven't looked for it. So that's what Brian did, is he looked for this in detail. He's still alive today. He's been knighted. He spent his career looking at malaria, not at the effects of helminths, but very early in his career, this was a major advance that he made. Within a couple of years, he tried it in some laboratory animals and found that he could, in fact, rescue them from lupus. He was using a protist or protozoan, not a helminth, but in his words, it was obvious that it was a combination of the helminths and the protozoans that were making a difference. And just a few years later, a British epidemiologist, and not just an epidemiologist, he was a surgeon working for the Royal Navy, found that his soldiers who accidentally got a worm lost their seasonal allergy, just dissipated. And then when they got rid of the worms, then the seasonal allergies came back. And that was Peter John Preston back in 1970. And then a few years later, John Turton gave himself on purpose 250 hookworms. Now, those of you who know anything about Helminth therapy know that that's about 10 times more than he probably should have given himself. And talking with him, he because of the adverse effects that he had, he never thought Helminth therapy would. He didn't even cross his mind that somebody else would do it on purpose. He basically did this as a sacrifice to science. He did take way too many worms, but the bottom line is that his seasonal allergies did go away as long as he had the worms. He said he'd had them for all of his life, and then came back when he got rid of the intestinal worms. So now we're going to go a little bit more, and this is one of the studies that Detlev Ghosh, who's on the call today, was involved with, dealing with inflammatory bowel disease. This was done by Joel Weinstock in Iowa. What they found was that when they gave patients who had chronic inflammatory bowel disease that were in general not responsive to pharmaceuticals, which means they're going to have to get a bowel resection. They're headed for surgery. They're going to lose a part of their colon. Almost 80% of those patients got better with the porcine whipworm, or it's called TSO, the Trichuris ova. And you can still buy that product today. It's still on the market. We'll talk some more about this one and what happened to it in clinical trials. It's a little bit of an unfortunate story there. The bottom line was they saw a very good effect in the very early studies. A study came out just 2 years later from Argentina, very impressive study. They had about 500 patients that had relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis. 12 of those patients accidentally acquired an intestinal worm. When a patient acquired an intestinal worm, they put them in the study, and they took a control and put them in the study to match it up. And what you can see is that once the patients got an intestinal worm, their multiple sclerosis stopped progressing. We've confirmed that this will work using the studies that we do with my team, and we'll talk about those somewhat later. Especially with autoimmune disease, and this goes back to Brian Greenwood's work with lupus. You're seeing that the helminths have a very profound effect on autoimmune disease. And in this particular study, they acquired helminths by accident. They acquired a number of different kinds of helminths, both roundworms and flatworms, the two major classes of helminths, and both seem to have a similar effect. They did a later study showing that protists would also work to alleviate multiple sclerosis. So this is a very recent paper that we published in Evolution Medicine and Public Health, looking at the idea that we've got a tremendous number of autoimmune diseases that can be induced by viral infections, and you'll see SARS-CoV-2 on the list here. Many of the adverse reactions of SARS-CoV-2 we saw in the United States were associated with autoimmune-like reactions. We predicted that we would see less of those in low-income countries which lack what we call systems hygiene. They don't have widespread use of toilets. Now, that's not to say, of course, that air pollution and the complete lack of medicine and in the presence of tuberculosis and other things won't make SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 worse in those countries, but we do expect to see less of the kinds of severe reactions that we see in the United States and in Western Europe. There's been, waiting to see what comes from the data from India right now, but certainly Africa and other parts of the developing world looks like they have escaped to some extent some of the problems with COVID-19 that we have encountered in the high income countries. What my group at Duke has worked on quite a bit is what we call an analysis of people who are self-treating. We're looking at, and we've looked at over 1,000 individuals now. We work with the sociologist Janet Wilson, who's accustomed to studying individuals that are acting outside of the mainstream, and they're taking matters into their own hands and using helminths to treat themselves. I've been accused of publishing what we call anecdotal data now, and I think this is, the idea here is so prevalent in the scientific community that this will be the first time I've ever shown just a slide on what is anecdotal data. So anecdotal data is basically a bit of information with no context. So if you say that a person drank a glass of water and then died, that's an anecdote, because we know that millions of people die every day, and most people drink glasses of water. That has no context. This is not concerning that a person drank a glass of water and then they died. I mean, it's no more so than it would be if they just died in general. Now, if you say, well, 27 people drank a glass of water and they died, this is also not any more concerning than if you said 27 people died. It's, again, millions of people die every day. So out of those millions of people that died, there's a good chance that 27 of them had consumed a glass of water prior to dying. If we keep going and we say that it was on a specific container on a specific day, then that might seem more concerning, but you still have to have more context. Were they in a war zone? Did they also all have bullet wounds? Were they in, was there a bomb that went off? And then finally, if we eliminate these other possibilities, we can see, okay, now there will be a police investigation. They're going to find out who poisoned this container of water, right? That would be the guess, that something was wrong with this water or the glasses that it was served in. You've got to track this down. This is no longer an anecdote. This is a concerning situation. All right, so that's how we approach the socio-medical studies. We try to narrow down what's going on sufficiently well so that we can draw some conclusions. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that data has panned out for us. There's things called placebo effects, and there's also a nocebo effect that's often confused with the placebo effects. We're fairly certain, we can conclude that our studies are not due to, at least in large part, not due to placebo or nocebo effects. And there's a lot of reasons. I'll point out that when many people try a helminth, they actually don't expect anything good to happen. They're trying it because they're maybe getting some pressure from their friends, or they're sort of desperate. So in those cases, you don't expect a positive or beneficial effect from the placebo idea or placebo concept, which comes from your expectations as well as your prior conditioning. And at point number 10 down here, a lot of people who are in control groups with placebos will report gastrointestinal distress. Again, that is an actual placebo effect. If they think they have a distress, it's not a positive. With worms, the placebo effect is often not positive. When we see positive effects, we're less concerned about the placebo effect or the nocebo effect. Especially since the nocebo effect, for example, would be something as it's just people got better anyway. If you gave a bunch of people with the rhinovirus, just a common cold, a drug, they will all get better in 4 or 5 days, whether or not you give them the drug or not. That's called a nocebo effect. Doesn't matter whether they have a placebo or not, they're just going to get better. The fact that these people who are trying these helminths often have very chronic conditions, some of them more than 20 years or even more than 30 years, tells us that it's not just a simple type of nocebo effect. And even under the best conditions, a placebo effect only lasts about 6 months. All right. This is this is about 1/20th of our data. It's a survey study that we did where we can eliminate survivor bias. Now, we can get everyone within a group who tried the Helminth. We're not just cherry picking, or there hasn't been some kind of elimination process. This was done for us by one of the suppliers who gave a survey to everyone who got a Helminth from him or her. And what you can see is two things here. The effectiveness of the Helminth seems to be better than the effectiveness of the medical treatment on the left. And the side effects of the Helminth on the right are less than the side effects of the medical treatment. There is a selection bias here. These people probably didn't try the Helminth unless they had a bad experience with their medical treatment, which makes sense. If their medical treatment worked perfectly, there's a good chance they would not have tried a Helminth. So there's a selection bias here, but there's no what we call survivor bias. So we're looking at everyone who tried the Helminth. About 20% of these people had neuropsychiatric conditions. Some of them had allergies, and some of them had autoimmune and digestive troubles as well. So a lot of skin conditions that we saw here as well. It's a mixed bag in terms of what kind of conditions that we're seeing. We've done other studies more with interviews and with the doctors looking at different conditions specifically and parsing those out. And I often get a lot of questions about specific conditions. And by specific chronic inflammatory conditions related to digestive or neuropsychiatric or allergic or autoimmune. And that we did make some very important observations, I think, and one of those is that the range of the effective dose for a Helminth depends on the Helminth. That's not surprising, but what's more surprisingly to us, I think, is that it depends on the individual. So for a given Helminth, some individuals just need more Helminths than others, and if by a low set point, we mean these individuals have a positive beneficial effect of very low numbers of Helminths, relatively low numbers of Helminths. And those individuals, if they take more Helminths, they will have problems. They may have digestive disorders or just a reaction to the Helminth. And that depends, the kinds of or adverse reactions they have will depend on the type of Helminth. We're going to take a little more detailed look at those kinds of reactions with Helminths later on, and that do depend on the Helminths. One of the things that we were surprised to find out was that Helminths do apparently affect neuropsychiatric function. And I mentioned a little bit earlier that this was one of the things that Helminth can do, is affect things such as major depressive disorder. Those disorders are very common now. We think that they are associated with the evolutionary mismatch of biota alteration, the loss of Helminths from the ecosystem of the human body. The system right now, and we have in the United States at least, is essentially overwhelmed. Here we're showing that in the state I live in North Carolina, more than 70% of the children who have a neuropsychiatric disorder are not getting treated, which is astounding. But what's even more astounding is that over 15% of all children have this disorder. So it's probably not surprising that the system is simply overwhelmed and can't help them right now. This is a completely different study showing you similar numbers. That's from the Center for Disease Control. The idea that having a complex biota can affect neuropsychiatric disorders is not new. It's just there wasn't any solid data supporting it. This is a opinion piece written by Emily Deans, who's a physician in the Northeast, written back in 2011. It's now 10 years old. This is, again, probably should not have been surprising to us that you could take a Helminth and your depression might dissipate. And we did back translate this just the same as Brian Greenwood did back in 1968. We took it back into the lab, tried it in laboratory rats, worked with a prominent neuroscientist named Stacy Bobo, and found that yes, indeed, Helminths will protect laboratory animals from neuropsychiatric problems. We used a model for sort of a mental fog kind of model with inflammation causing mental fog that you frequently see after surgical operations. This brings us up to where we are today. I kind of give you a little bit of history of what's going on and what we've looked at. It's important to know that I'd say the humans have really only tried 5 different helminths. And we wrote a paper about this recently with a collaborator that we have in the Czech Republic. There's only 5 worms that people have examined or tried for therapy. It's been a little bit haphazard which worms we tried. The 5 worms are shown here. You see the big one. Can everyone see my cursor on the screen? Yeah, okay, thanks. So this is the bovine tapeworm. It's huge, it's 26 feet long. This is not to scale. If this was to scale, then this bottle of TSO here would be, it would be what, 3 feet tall, and that's not correct. It's a very small bottle that contains 2,500 of these organisms. So you can see sort of the difference in size here. The different life stages, but this is a hookworm, this is a whipworm, this is a rat tapeworm here that does not grow to a maturity in humans. These are the ones that have been tried. The bovine tapeworm was only tried by a couple of people, and they gave up on that for reasons of just it couldn't be tolerated, not because of pain, but because the little egg sacs pop off and they wiggle when they come out the anus, and they come out the anus when you're not expecting it, so it's very unpleasant, is the bottom line. That one just never became popular, never took off. The human whipworm now is just not very popular. A few people use it, especially for ulcerative colitis, but it turns out that probably the TSO and the HDC will work just as well for that. And the hookworm, as we'll talk about in a little bit, well, and let's go ahead and go to the next slide. The only reason the hookworm is really used now, despite its kickback, it has some adverse effects if used too much, is because it's so cheap and easy to produce. It's incredibly easy to acquire it and to keep it going. It doesn't take much time, and it takes very little in the way of financial resources, but it is slower acting, which means that when you look at the clinical trials with this worm, there's no way they could do a good dose escalation scheme. It would just take too long. You really need to start out low and move up high so that you can find everyone's set point for these things. Not only can the application to the skin cause problems in many people, but it does have extensive adverse side effects in overdose. It's the most invasive of any of the worms that anyone's trying right now. It actually buries itself in the head into the small intestine and drinks blood, which can, if given too many, it can cause joint pain. It can cause chronic fatigue-like syndromes. And ironically, then chronic fatigue is one of the ones that one of the conditions that can be treated with Helminth therapy, but it's completely different fatigue that you can get from overdose of this particular helminth. But again, it's popular only because it's so inexpensive and easy to transmit. And the one that Duke has patented or is working on patent some of the isolation equipment or technology around, it has problems with storage. It has to be used fresh. It's not easy to work with. You have to be an expert in this organism to really work with it. It is fairly fast acting, and it's non-invasive. It swims around in the gut, similar to say a yogurt bacteria, something in that nature. And then the Tricherasus ova, it's not nearly as invasive as the hookworm, but it still does breach the epithelial barrier in some way or another. It is also time consuming to produce and purify. So there's right now only one group that does that, and that probably, I think, will remain the case. They are experts in producing that. It has excellent stability in storage, which makes it better for practical intents and purposes than the rat tapeworm. It is relatively fast acting, and it's easy to it's easy to administer in an oral solution. And for both of these two worms, for the rat tapeworm and for the TSO, for the porcine whipworm, those are what we call non-colonizing. That means they don't live to maturity in the human gut, except for very, very rare occasions, perhaps in immunosuppressed children. That means you need to take them on a regular basis. There's some convenience in that for people who need to modulate their dose on a regular basis. The hookworm, of course, lives in the human body, can live there for years, and which is a problem. If you get too much of it, then you'll have to get that removed. Now, the TSO did have problems in some of the clinical trials, and this is something that we've looked at in detail. Unfortunately, if you read the medical literature, and there, for example, there's a review here written in 2018, the people writing the literature don't appear to be aware that there were problems with those clinical trials, which included, and we've published this information, there's misformulation of the Helminths that was out of the control of the scientists that really knew the organism. The dose range wasn't considered. In some of the studies, many of the patients just got better, which means they didn't have good patient selection. So there haven't been what I would say are incisive trials looking at, can we reverse this issue of biota alteration using Helminth therapy? I think that's critical. Moving forward, you have to wonder what's been the problem. And a lot of people think that the problem is the ick factor. I can tell you that the problem is not the ick factor. When we've looked at this, there's a few percentage of people that will just never try a Helminth. It's less than 5%, but most people will try a Helminth. Most being more than 90% will try a Helminth if their social network tells them it's a reasonable thing to do. And there's, again, a few percent, less than 5%, that will just try a Helminth no matter what. Even if nobody tells them it's okay, they'll still try a Helminth. And that's probably a characteristic of human populations, that there's some leaders, there's a lot of followers, and then there's some people that just stay behind no matter what. So it's not the ick factor. It's probably has to do with marketing and how you communicate this. That's why you can so easily sell a can of germs and call it yogurt, some made up name that makes it sound good, and show a picture of a healthy baby and probably set to go there. But that's, again, not the issue with moving forward with this. It's been a problem not just for Helminths, but also for another type of therapy, which is extremely helpful, called the fecal transplant. And as many of you know, there's a condition you can get from using antibiotics called recurrent Clostridium difficile colitis. It's extremely deadly and extremely common. Tens of thousands of people have died since the implementation of antibiotics in this country in the clinic in the 1940s. That could have been prevented with a simple fecal transplant. It was demonstrated to work in 1958, but it still is not standard of care. You can still die from recurrent Clostridium difficile colitis in the United States, having never known that you could receive a fecal transplant. So the Helminth therapy is kind of in the same situation for seasonal allergies, for inflammatory bowel disease, and for multiple sclerosis, and now for neuropsychiatric disorders as well. We think we have a handle on why things aren't moving forward, and it's the same problem probably that folks faced with the fecal therapy, and Dr. Sherman may have faced this with the maggot therapy as well. I would be very curious to hear the perspective on that. One of those issues is that the profit margins on Helminths may not promise to be the same as they are for the pharmaceutical industry, especially if you have difficulty in patenting your product, or especially if the product needs to be just widespread prophylactic use. Or in other words, even if you're not sick, you probably need some of these just to maintain normal immune function and prevent an allergy or an autoimmune disease from occurring. Another issue that we have, and that I run into quite a bit when it comes to getting federal dollars for research, is that federal dollars for research that filter through the NIH are really focused on science. They're focused on how do we put science into practice. And while I'm talking about some very basic biology here that we're missing Helminths, the science these days involves molecular genetic mechanisms. So if you have, you know, in the work that I do with the transplantation, solid organ transplantation, it's very focused on specific molecules and inhibition of very specific immunological pathway. That's the kind of work that we think of as scientific. Just applying a basic principle of evolutionary mismatch is not necessarily thought of as the most scientific. And you know, folks ask me, well, why don't you look at the individual molecules? And I explain to them, you know, that's probably a red herring. And there's so many of those molecules, and we probably just need the worms back, you know, in a controlled manner, in a domesticated manner. We don't want to go back to living without sanitation. Obviously, that's, you know, we don't need to trade an autoimmune disease for typhoid and amoebic dysentery. So the goals for the future, this is a future worm here. This is the actual Disney character, which I was unaware of until I looked up future worm, and that's what you find. I don't know what future worm does, but what we hope our future worms will do is that we, number one, need to get the clinical trials done. We have some worms that are available. We know how to produce them. We need to have them done in a way that takes into account the special needs of the Helminths, which that hasn't been done very well up until this point. We do need to actually do a systematic search for new species and evaluate the effect of those species. Again, our species selection, only 5 species have ever been looked at. There's probably hundreds out there that might be good candidates that no one's ever looked for. And then finally, and this is something that is moving forward with the TSO, that eventually we hope they'll be just sold in the grocery stores similar to yogurt bacteria. That's the hope for the future, to regulate immune function. And here I want to, this is the end of the slides, I want to point out that Helminths are not magic bullets. There are other evolutionary mismatches. Vitamin D deficiency and especially chronic psychological stress do play a central role in induction of especially the neuropsychiatric and autoimmune diseases that we see Helminths affecting. So it's got to be part of a healthy lifestyle in general to normalize the biome. We see a lot of our participants in our studies thinking, oh, I've got a Helminth, now I'm fine. But they're not controlling their stress, and their diets are not good. They're almost using the Helminth as a crutch to misbehave. And of course, absolutely not the goal here. I'll stop sharing right now. I have many people in my lab over the years to thank that got me to this point. I'll turn it back over to Dr. Sherman.
Thank you, Dr. Parker. That was an excellent overview, and your insights for the future are really very significant and very important. I have a couple of questions, but I'm going to ask Albert if there were any questions sent in on the chat, and also ask our participants to raise their hands or unmute to see if they have any questions first. Albert?
No, there are no questions that I can see in the chat, Dr. Sherman.
Does anyone here in the on the Zoom link have a question for Dr. Parker? Okay.
It
Well,
looks like Dan may have raised his hand, I think.
oh, okay.
Yeah, I have a question.
Super.
Yeah, sorry I can't. The light is funny. The Helminths for something like lichen planus. I guess what you were discussing. I had a question about the NDCs, the cysticercoids. And you mentioned that you felt like those were, I was impressed. It seemed to be safe in terms of that they don't colonize and that they don't embed themselves into the digestive tract.
Also, right. So let's say that, let me qualify that and say that they don't embed themselves in the digestive tract, and that we would think that would be ideal unless they actually need to, right? And that's something that's unknown right now. So maybe one that embeds itself in the digestive tract will simply work better. And it's you know, so the TSO is sort of in between the hookworm and the HDC. So it's a little bit embedded in there between the large bowel and the small bowel, whereas the hookworm is absolutely embedded in the small bowel. And furthermore, it tunnels through the lungs to get in the small bowel. And the hookworm is a good example of one that may have beneficial effects because it's so invasive. You just have to control the numbers very tightly. And those beneficial effects might occur in the lung and have benefits that the other helminths just don't have. So that's all remains to be seen, and that's what needs to come out in clinical studies, is when you're comparing and contrasting different worms, you know, can we get a profile which is completely non-invasive but does everything we want it to do? Maybe not.
Okay, thank you.
I wrote a number of questions before this lecture, but I'm going to put those aside because I've got some new questions in listening to your talk, really. And one of the things you mentioned was some of the difficulties associated with studying people who are using Helminthic therapy not as part of a planned clinical trial. In addition to the lack of, in addition to the difficulty of being able to draw conclusions from information that may be somewhat incomplete sometimes, or the differences between each patient, and in addition to the difficulties of getting anyone to publish what you are able to get from that, because it's just a case series or just anecdotal reports and so on and so forth. I would imagine it's also difficult to find a lot of these people. There must be tons of people using this therapy or another therapy that we don't even know about.
Well, so it turns it right. So this has been, of course, a big part of my life for the last 10 years is doing this and working with sociologists. It's not as it's not as hard as you would think. Now, it does take a big chunk of your life, but there's certain things you learn you just can't do. For example, you can't ask one of your vendors, hey, could you send out some surveys and just see what you get back? Because only people who are disgruntled will send back a survey. Now you say, I shouldn't say only, it's about a 70-to-1 ratio. So if you have 70 people that are happy, one that's unhappy, you'll get, on average, you'll get 2 surveys, one from a happy person and one from an unhappy person, because the unhappy people are not satisfied. But there are ways. So for example, you can talk to a supplier who has followed up with every single person. You can get information from them. You can talk to a medical doctor who has patients who've told him or her, hey, I'm going to do this. And that medical doctor will tell you, this is the percent that reported that in their next follow-up visit told me nothing happened. This is the percent that told me something went great. And this is the percent that told me, well, this was a horrible experience. So what we see is a very, very consistent, you know, in different places at different times, we see very consistent reporting. And it's similar to what we saw on our survey study where we were able to eliminate survivor bias. So it's important to get to the people, not just the people that are trying the helminths, but the people who are working with those that are trying the helminths. It's sort of the observational, the group that's observing more closely than I can. And you know, I do get a number of cases that come in, but as you said, so we got a really good, for example, story about narcolepsy, and it's an anecdote. It truly is an anecdote, except that, you know, there's some additional information if they go off the Helminths. There's a investigator named Ping Lok who studies the human whipworm and one individual patient with ulcerative colitis. And when that person loses their whipworm, their ulcerative colitis will come back, and they can monitor that by scoping the patient, so on. So it's more than an anecdote, and I think that's certainly true with our patient with narcolepsy. But we don't know how many people with narcolepsy would be helped by Helminths. We got, on the other hand, a really good handle on how many with multiple sclerosis might be helped and how many with inflammatory disease might be helped. Because there's so many of those out there, and there's enough doctors and suppliers monitoring the situation that they can give us feedback that seems to be consistent coming across the board.
So it sounds like one of the things that helps is to think about it in terms of a community or a team, and you want all the different people that play a role and know something, not just patients,
Right.
The isolated group of patients.
That's
So-
correct. Yeah. And if you can get a group of patients and you can get the entire group, that would be, and they're not even patients, they're participants, right? So, but I can't do that, whereas a supplier can or a doctor can.
So the Better Foundation and its board of directors has pondered a similar type of issue. How do we get some data that could be mined in a meaningful way from people who are participating in biotherapy in general, not on clinical trials.
Right. We still are very interested in doing that kind of work for the fecal therapy, not a fecal transplant subsequent to C. diff colitis, because that's everywhere in the literature now and it's known to work. But there's other conditions such as inflammatory bowel disease that are probably helped by fecal therapy and by Helminth therapy, because both of the bacteria, probably for reasons that I think we understand, may sort of go wrong in that condition. So it just takes a tremendous amount of time, and of course work with your IRB, and it's, you know, social networking is very important.
We've been tossing around the idea of setting up some clinical registries where patients, their clinicians, and other providers can provide some clinical information, some data. Have you looked at that in any way, and what has been your experience, or what is your thought about that? Acknowledging that, again, it's not comprehensive, it's not easily controlled.
Right. So part of the issue is it goes back to this thing of people who are not satisfied are much more likely to try to contribute, which can and will bias your data in a negative way. If you talk to a supplier though, they can tell you, well, you know, I have 85 customers. I started out with 100, I still have 85, and 2 of them are really unhappy. And of course, you know, the 85 that has been a customer for 5 years, they're not going to, they feel like, hey, I paid for this. I don't want to do any research. I don't want people to know that I'm doing this. Or for whatever reason, they're just not responsive. Maybe they don't have time. But the supplier will know they have 85 steady customers, and that tells them a lot. And then whereas they've lost 15, for example. So that's helpful. The registry that we have for Helminths right now, I think, I can't give it a stamp of approval because I'm not authorized to do that, but I can say that it's called Helminth Wiki. We have checked it, and it does seem to be very reliable. So for example, if I hear of a couple of cases of condition X, say you've got a kind of fibrosis that has an adverse response to Helminth therapy, then once I start hearing about those cases, they will appear very rapidly on Helminth Wiki. And then, you know, adverse reactions, those kinds of things. And so there's a private individual that curates Helminth Wiki, and that's basically his full-time job. And I think he does a pretty good job of it. Now, what he can't do is he can't say, well, okay, this person tried this worm, say they brought TSO, but clearly, you know, they didn't try it for very long. They didn't try to increase their dose when it wasn't working. So they probably didn't give it a good try. So he won't do that. He'll just put the information out there as it is. And then of course somebody who's read the academic papers will figure that out, that, oh, okay, that person probably didn't give it the best shot they could have. But that's not the kind of thing that the curator will make a quality comment on. Yeah, so it makes it, to digest it all, it's helpful to have the biology and medicine and an immunology. And we try to put that out there. But, and again, as you can see from that review with the TSO and inflammatory bowel disease, people, even the clinicians who are writing reviews in the scientific literature, there's a lack of understanding about the whole Helminth therapy and how it can work and what's been done with it.
We have but 1 minute left, and I don't see any hands raised here. Albert, were there any other questions you saw coming through? No.
No other questions.
All right, well then I'll ask just one final question, because this took me by surprise, and that is the issue of vitamin D, actually. The recognition of low vitamin D levels in the population is relatively early, relatively recently. And for me personally, I started checking vitamin D levels in my patients over 50 a few years ago, and it was so prevalent that I then started checking in my patients over 40 and then 30, and I'm seeing vitamin D deficiency in 22-year-olds now, commonly. Some authorities say it's not a concern, it's so prevalent that it must be normal. I tend to treat it. I don't know that it's normal. I'm anxious. And so I treat low vitamin D levels. But I was totally unaware of the connection, unless it's just that it participates in the immune functioning. But is there a connection more direct with parasites? What am I missing? What do I need to know?
Yeah, my guess on that, Dr. Sherman, would be that if you just have vitamin D deficiency, you can get very, very, very deficient until you literally get rickets without incurring tremendous risk for autoimmune or neuropsychiatric diseases. But when you add in these other things that we have, the chronic stress, and you add in the loss of these complex eukaryotic symbionts such as helminths and protists, I think then the vitamin D deficiency begins to show up more as a big risk factor. So it's sort of this combination of factors that any one alone may not be too bad. I think probably the loss of the helminths is a little bit worse than the vitamin D deficiency. And then the chronic stress may be, equally as bad or as either of those, or maybe those combined. So when you add it all up, then you get a perfect storm for immune dysfunction. And I think that's probably when, and of course, prevention is better than a cure. It always has been, and it always will be, most likely. So, it's those studies looking at vitamin D reconstitution, right? There were several holes in the boat that caused it to start to sink. So it could be hard to get it going just by solving the vitamin D issue, although I do keep hearing good reports about vitamin D reconstitution at the functional medicine conferences.
Well, thank you very, very much for your talk and for joining us today.
It's been
On
my pleasure.
behalf of the Better Foundation and all of us watching right now, thank you. This was great. And I hope to talk to you again in the coming months. With that, I'll end the meeting. Bye-bye. Bye-bye to all.
Thanks, Dr. Sherman.